June 24th, 2023, Day 1. The Wagner Group, a pro-Russian paramilitary group now turned enemy, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, continues his march to Moscow, with Yevgeny Prigozhin not caring about the consequences of his actions and only wanting one thing: the downfall of Vladimir Putin. Before this happened, the Wagner Group helped Putin fight against Ukraine during the beginning of the war, but then Prigozhin claimed that Russian troops attacked them and then they ended up falling out with Putin. As a response to this, Prigozhin led a rebellion against Putin on June 24, 2023, where the Wagner Group marched towards Moscow, but they ended up turning around because Prigozhin wanted to avoid further bloodshed from happening, in his words. And then later on, his plane just mysteriously crashed and killed him. I wonder what happened there. Anyways, in this timeline, things are different. Prigozhin doesn't chicken out like he did in our timeline, and instead moves his troops the last 200 kilometers that he didn't in our timeline. After a few hours, Prigozhin then finally reaches Moscow and begins to prepare the siege to the capital. By this point, many elite Russian military units have defected to Prigozhin, and when nightfall arrives, Prigozhin then launches the attack on Moscow. With Putin's orders, loyalist troops clash with Wagner troops, and Moscow is placed under martial law, and the battle for Moscow and the Russian Civil War officially begin. Day 14. After 2 weeks of intense fighting, the Kremlin palace is officially secured by the Wagner Group, but before they take it over, Putin flees to St. Petersburg, and Prigozhin officially proclaims himself the new Kremlin of Russia. This event shocks the world, as just 2 weeks ago, Russia was a perfectly stable country, and then all of a sudden, it erupted into civil war. NATO then plans on moving a significant amount of troops onto the borders of the westernmost NATO countries, ready to invade Russia in order to secure its nuclear weapons before it falls into the wrong hands, which would be the main concern of every other country in the world. In response to that, China also plans on moving troops to northern China, as well as trying to cooperate with the Mongolian government in order to move Chinese troops into northern Mongolia so that they could be ready to secure Russia's nuclear weapons in the Far East. Over in Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky is planning on taking advantage of the chaos that is happening in Russia to launch a counteroffensive in order to take back eastern Ukraine. Day 30. After a month since the Wagner rebellion started, Putin loses more and more cities to Prigozhin supporters. During the Wagner rebellion, it became evident that a lot of Russians did in fact support Prigozhin and celebrated him occupying cities as well as he made his march towards Russia. In a survey done by the Russian field just a little over a week after the Wagner rebellion, it was found that 55% of Russians supported Prigozhin, but that support went down to about 29% after he failed. This means that if the survey is accurate, then the majority of Russians do support Prigozhin, which would play a huge factor during the Civil War. Even if the survey is skewed, which it most likely was because it was conducted less than 2 weeks after the revolution, it's clear that a lot of Russians did in fact support Prigozhin over Putin. As the front lines for the Civil War began to form, smaller regions of Russia begin to declare independence, and Belarus also breaks out into civil unrest, with the Belarusians making another attempt to overthrow Lukashenko. Up until this point, all the West and China have done so far is prepare their troops to prevent any spillover in Eastern European countries, as well as potentially invading Russia for their nuclear weapons and to also stabilize it, but they have not yet acted in fear of escalating the situation. When parts of Russia begin to declare independence, as well as uprising in Belarus happen, the West then has an excuse to invade Russia, but only purely to help those parts of Russia gain independence, as well as the Belarusians overthrow Lukashenko, and also help the Kaliningrads overthrow the fortress that is the Russian military in that region, as well so that they can gain independence too. Day 60. 2 months into the Civil War, and Prigozhin consolidates most of his control over southern Russia, excluding the Caucasus, because by this point, NATO has moved their troops into all the breakaway regions in Russia to help them officially secure their independence so that they could either be independent permanently or negotiate their re-entry into Russia later by whoever wins the Civil War. The West and China have also started special ops missions on preventing immediate threats from taking control over Russian nukes. And as for China, they also end up invading the far east of Russia so that they can remove the nuclear threat in that region entirely, since there isn't nearly as much nukes in the far east compared to Western Russia. Moving over into Belarus, and Lukashenko has officially fallen, and the rest helps the Belarusians form a new pro-Russian government that will be put on the path to join the EU and NATO in the future. Over in Ukraine, and all Putin's forces end up either defecting to or being forced to defect to the Wagner group, since they were cut off from Putin. And with all the chaos from the switch in administration, combined with struggles to maintain new logistics, the Ukrainians are able to take full advantage of the situation to take back full control over their country over the course of the past 2 months. From there, they focus on consolidating control as well as using their military to help other breakaway regions of Russia gain independence. The same thing also happens in Georgia. With Russia now being fully cut off from the region, they're able to invade all of their territory that Russia occupied and re-annex it, as well as Mongolia being able to re-annex Transnistria as well. Day 90. 3 months into the Russian Civil War, and things are not looking good for Putin. More and more Russians are joining Prigozhin's cause, and they are slowly but surely moving towards St. Petersburg. Chinese troops also team up with Siberian rebels that want to gain independence, and they successfully capture major cities as well as the Trans-Siberian Railway, bringing the majority of Siberia under their control. From there, they start making plans to defend the Trans-Siberian Railway from either Putin or Prigozhin, who at this point in the Civil War would be getting close to the Ural Mountains. Although China wouldn't be able to set up defenses right away in the Ural Mountains, they would be able to defend the Trans-Siberian Railway in case Putin or Prigozhin were to ever try to take back Siberia. In the West, they are mainly focused on special ops missions in Russia to prevent any warlords from gaining control over any nuclear weapons, as well as building up governments in all of the breakaway regions of Russia, as well as in Belarus, while also helping to rebuild the damage done to their land as well. Day 120 onward. Over the coming months, Putin loses more and more control of Prigozhin as he begins to close in on St. Petersburg. By this point, it is clear that Putin will inevitably lose the war, and any foreign aid that he has been receiving gets cut off. Putin by this point has fully lost control over Siberia, with the Chinese having firm control over the Siberian Railway, along with also setting up the logistics to move Chinese troops to the Ural Mountains to help defend the Siberian Railway from Prigozhin and Putin. Siberia has officially broken away from Russia by this point to form its own country, which is basically a de facto puppet to China, where they are now scrambling to set up the logistics to mine Siberia's oil resources and rare earths. As the days go by, pro-Prigozhin forces move closer and closer to St. Petersburg, and then eventually St. Petersburg is conquered and pro-Prigozhin troops move into Putin's bunker, only to find out that he pulled an Austrian painter. With Putin's death, there's no one left to lead the Russian loyalists, and then pretty soon Prigozhin conquers all that is left of Russia. In the end, Prigozhin is left with a devastated Russia that is now surrounded by enemies on all sides. Any ally that Russia had beforehand supported Putin and not Prigozhin, and even then, countries like China betrayed Putin for their own personal gains. Because of that, Prigozhin is then forced to turn Russia into a North Korean-style isolationist terrorist state. If you think the world economy is bad right now, in our timeline, in this timeline, the world economy would be devastated. China would be focusing all of their manpower scrambling to build all the infrastructure and oil pipelines in Siberia that are needed in order to mine all of the oil and rare earths in Siberia to be able to use and sell to the rest of the world. Until China is able to reach that point, the oil and gas crisis that the world has had to endure up to this point because of the Ukraine war would get way worse during and after the Civil War, because countries who have sanctioned Russia still get Russian oil through certain loopholes, even though they have sanctioned them. But in this timeline, most of Russia's oil pipelines would have been destroyed in the Civil War. Even with just the Ukraine war in our timeline, there were plenty of major oil pipelines that were destroyed, and in this timeline, that would be on a much larger scale in Russia in this timeline. On top of Russia not being able to sell their oil and gas to countries that are sanctioned through loopholes, countries who didn't sanction Russia like China and India wouldn't be able to get Russian oil as well, which would mean that every country would be competing for the little oil and gas that they can get their hands on, which would just make gas prices extremely high and other oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia extremely rich. Whatever operational oil pipelines Russia has left would still be useless because they have just come out of a civil war and all the oil and gas companies in Russia would have collapsed, and Prigozhin's new regime would be focused on getting Russia back on its feet, putting down rebellions, and reforming and restructuring Russia. On top of that, they have also lost access to the Baku oil fields in the Caucasus, who wouldn't have the logistic capabilities upon independence to sell their oil. Countries like Canada, who have reduced their oil mining, would have no choice but to restart oil production, and all other countries who had climate goals would have no choice but to set them aside temporarily for the greater good. Aside from the oil crisis, Europe would also be devastated with the amount of money spent on troops trying to prop up newly independent countries, as well as rapidly trying to reform the EU to be able to expand into all these new countries. By the time the 2024 US election happens, the world would be an absolutely horrendous place to live in. It would basically be like the global pandemic again, with the government ordering all jobs that are able to or can be capable of moving online to do so in order to ration their gas and oil reserves. Even with those measures, people still wouldn't be able to get all the energy they need, especially during the Civil War, where other countries who have deployed their militaries to defend Eastern Europe, as well as making sure that Russia's nuclear weapons are secured by warlords and terrorists, would need a lot of oil and gas in order for the militaries to function. During the time period the Civil War lasts, extreme measures to prevent running out of energy would have to be taken, like turning off power at specific times during the day, as well as cracking down on companies' uses of energy. Even then, people wouldn't get the energy they need, which would be very problematic during the winter time, where people wouldn't be able to consistently heat their houses as well as pay their energy bills for their homes. Plenty of cities around the world would rebel, to the point where countries would have to declare martial law in some of their cities. About 6 months after the Civil War ends, in the 2024 election, Donald Trump will most likely still win the election like in our timeline, and he will most likely be even more popular than in our timeline, because in our timeline, people blame the Democrats for allowing the Ukraine war to happen in our timeline. And in this timeline, that same war would lead to the Russian Civil War happening, so Trump would heavily propagandize that to win the election. Even after the election, he would still be popular because everything that makes him controversial now would be much more appealing to the American public. Because with them playing a significant role in the Russian Civil War, isolationism would be a much more popular ideology for the future of America to follow, as many American lives were lost to the Russian Civil War when they tried to continue nuclear weapons, as well as propping up the new European countries. Trump also probably wouldn't tariff other countries like crazy because, unlike in our timeline, Trump wouldn't be focused on long-term survival for America, but instead short-term survival. As part of that would be having to work together with other countries in order to come out of the situation. Trump would still probably try to annex Canada and Greenland, which would also be much more justifiable in this timeline because over in Asia, China would be slowly integrating Siberia and Mongolia by extension into the country by building new infrastructure to mine resources, gain access to oil deposits, and connect Mongolia and Siberia better with new roads and infrastructure. Trump would use that for justification to annex Canada and Greenland, as well as annexing them for the natural resources as another main justification. Whether Trump would be desperate enough to invade Canada or Greenland, or use the situation to diplomatically convince the Canadians and Greenlanders to join, fearmonger them, or even just using heavy bribery and election interference, I believe that with a combination of diplomatically turning Canadians and Greenlanders against their governments, combined with fearmongering, bribing officials, and interfering with their elections, combined with the desperation of the situation, I believe Trump would be able to successfully annex Canada and Greenland over time. Moving over to China, and eventually more and more Chinese workers would move into Siberia and Mongolia in order to mine their oil deposits and build roads and oil pipes to get all the oil they need for the country to function, as well as selling anything extra to other countries for a premium price. Over time, with all the Chinese moving into Mongolia and Siberia, they will put them on a path to eventually become part of China in the near future. Trump would use the threat of China annexing Mongolia and Siberia as one of the main parts of his propaganda campaign to justify annexing Canada and Greenland, and in turn, China would use Trump's annexations as an excuse to annex Mongolia and Siberia. Moving on to Europe, and the European Union is forced to rapidly reform all the corruption it has, and they use what has happened in Russia to justify getting rid of things like the veto, which will allow them to be able to reform many aspects of the EU, like forming a European army, as well as many other problems that they have been facing, one of which being the immigration crisis. In our timeline, immigration in Europe is already a problem, but now, with the Russian Civil War happening, many Russians have been forced to flee to other countries, mainly being European ones, which would cause a massive immigration crisis. That, combined with having to prop up new countries, investing in mining for oil in the Baku oil fields in the newly independent Caucasus countries, and propping up and integrating these new countries into the EU and NATO over time, and Europe is left with an absolutely devastating reality. Except for Switzerland, they're probably just chilling watching the world literally burn around them. There is one thing that would be beneficial from this awful situation that would happen, and that would be laying the foundations for pan-Europeanism. Over the course of all these events, the EU would start reforming and gaining more power, popularity, and members. Far-right ideologies where Europeans want full autonomy from other European countries, and far-left socialist ideologies would begin to decline with the new realities of the world that they have to face. Pan-Europeanism would become more and more of a necessary ideology to survive. Finland could then unify with the newly independent Karelian country, and now, without a breakaway Transnistrian region, Moldova and Romania could eventually finally unite. Over the remnants of Russia, Prigozhin would be trying hard to negotiate the re-entry of lost territories into Russia, but with no success. Eventually, over time, with his failure to fully restore Russia's territory, it would become less and less popular over time. The EU could then use this opportunity to slowly spread its influence into what's left of Russia in a great information war. The Eastern European countries would become completely militarized as the new Iron Curtain descends on Eastern Europe. Over time, the remnants of Russia continue to become more and more oppressed to the point where the country basically becomes a fascist, militarized, isolationist, terrorist, authoritarianism, whatever other no-no regime is out there, failed disappointment of a state. Inevitably, the Wagner Group would also fall, whether it be from a coup, or from uprisings, or another civil war, or from the Europeans teaming up with the Russians inside and outside of Russia. The Wagner Group's control over Russia would fall. I would say, for the sake of this scenario, that the EU launches a peacekeeping mission with the newly built European army to get rid of the Wagner Group's control over Russia by marching to the capital like they did, but then swiftly assassinating Prigozhin, which he failed to do with Putin during his revolution. The Europeans would then install a pro-EU government and immediately invest in trying to better Russia's economy, putting down uprisings to prevent another civil war from starting, and using their successes as propaganda to gain more support. This could also go very wrong depending on how things go, and could very well lead into another Afghanistan scenario, but because this is the darkest scenario I've done so far, I say let's let Russia have a break on this one. We'll just say that this coup happens in the 2040s, and with the information war combined with the Russians growing tired of the Wagner Group cracking down more and more of what little freedom they have left, the EU coup is welcomed with open arms by most Russians. Fast forwarding it a little bit into the future, and by this point the European Union is no longer reliant on other countries for its survival. They have successfully integrated all of Europe, including Russia, into the EU, and are now on a path on forming an EU federation and becoming a superpower, as well as India, who would also have formed its own sphere of influence to counteract Chinese expansionism. After the world economy is finally stabilized after the global pandemic, a Russian-Ukrainian war, bad economic policies from corrupt governments overall, and the biggest civil war in human history since, ironically enough, the Russian Revolution in our timeline, which led to the USA and the Soviet Union rising as global superpowers. In this timeline, however, four superpowers now rise onto the world stage. It starts off slowly, where the USA and China compete over mining and selling their resources in their newly acquired territories. As time goes on, China slowly completely takes over Russia's former sphere of influence, while India does the same with the USA's former influence in the Indo-Pacific when they go back into isolationism under Trump. After Trump's done his second term, the Republicans are able to successfully get into office again with the popularity they've gained over annexing all of Canada and Greenland, combined with also only making the Canadian provinces who were conservative into states, so that they can get as many conservative votes as possible. The new Republican government's goals now switch over to taking care of the cartel's control over Latin America by working together with all Latin American countries' governments to be able to wage war against them, while also focusing on creating better ties with them to eventually fold them into their new sphere of influence, with the original purpose of making America able to fully be isolationist by fully securing the Americas. Over time, as the USA, India, China, and the EU secure their spheres of influence, and the ice begins to melt, the USA and China build up Arctic fleets to be able to compete against each other in the Arctic. China and India clash over influence in the South China Sea and Taiwan, along with neutral countries in the South Pacific, the Indian Peninsula, and in the Middle East, while also competing against each other and the EU over influence over Africa. With the world returning to a state of chaos, it is becoming increasingly clear that the US will have to abandon its isolationist policies once more to take on China, India, the European Union, as well as all of their spheres of influence in the Second Cold War. Thank you all for watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified for any of these future videos that are coming up soon. Unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, I will be taking a break from posting regularly on YouTube because I'm currently working on a big project that will be really beneficial for the channel to put out, so I'd like to put all of my manpower into that project. So unfortunately, I won't be able to focus on uploading other videos for the channel. However, if you want more content, you can watch my future Borders of the World series that I'm posting on YouTube Shorts on a weekly basis in the meantime. Thanks again for watching. Don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot. And I'll see you all in the first special.